Welcome to the ReGen Brands podcast. This is a place for brands, retailers, investors, and other food system stakeholders to learn about the consumer brands supporting regenerative agriculture and how they're changing the world. This is your host, Kyle, joined by my co-host, AC, who's going to take us into the episode.
On this episode, we are talking about all things related to our recently released State of Regenerative CPG report. Many of you have already checked out the report, or at least heard us talk about it briefly on episode 81, where we unpacked the launch of our new ecosystem. The report synthesizes ReGen Brands' proprietary learnings from almost 3 years of studying regenerative CPG, including 80 podcast episodes, interviewing brand founders, executives, and other key ecosystem stakeholders. It is designed to help you understand the ways regenerative brands are winning today, along with the key challenges they face on the road to additional progress. This report is a super easy read, but it's definitely dense. So we wanted to unpack all of it for you today on this episode. So go download your copy and follow along, or just listen in as we dive deep into the comprehensive state of the industry. Let's go. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the ReGen Brands podcast. Very excited today to be dropping in for the first of 2 in a row solo pods with just Kyle and I. So what's up, brother?
Not too much, man. You know, this is the spot where I typically be like, hey, we're super excited to have so-and-so here, but that person's not here. So we're already off script. I already feel outside my comfort zone to a degree, but that's okay. That's why we're here.
We're super excited to just be here with each other, brother. That's what it's
true.
It is.
Yeah. Well, no, honestly, I think this is a cool episode. We're going to talk about the report, the white paper. It's been called so many different things. The State of Regenerative CPG that we put out because with the help of numerous others. And I think it's going to be fun to talk about. So yeah, looking forward to this.
Yeah, hell yeah. So as Kyle just alluded to, this episode is really dedicated to diving into the State of Regenerative CPG report, which we put out about a month and a half ago now when we launched the entire ecosystem. So if you listen to episode 81, where we talked about the launch, we did talk about the report a little bit, but we have not really done a deep dive into the contents of the report. And for those few hundred people that have downloaded it, y'all know it's rather meaty. So we wanted to unpack it here verbally with each other. But as Kyle said, we'd be very remiss not to start with some major shout outs to the people that help us put this thing together, which would be lead author Katie Finnegan. Huge shout out to Katie. Katie is an amazing human being. She did an amazing job helping us write this report, and just huge kudos to Katie for what this thing turned into. Major shout out to Jelly Shot, our design partner and our design team. They're amazing. They do amazing work. We'll drop a link to them in the comments or the show notes as well. But shout out to Jelly Shot, super appreciative for them. And then Christina Tober, who was our lead editor, who helped us get this behemoth down to something that was actually digestible enough for people to read it. So giant shout out to those 3 people and organizations for really helping us put this together, and excited to just unpack it all today because it's a giant accumulation. That's the word I was looking for, of, you know, the 2.5, 3 years of work that we've been doing on all this stuff together. So a lot to unpack for sure.
No doubt, you know, and it couldn't echo what you said more about the thank yous. This would not have been possible without those folks. Also, big credit to AC for leading the charge and putting this in together. I sat back and read it a couple times and provided a handful of notes, but AC, along with those others mentioned, really put this thing together. So I think it's important, like, before we even dive into it, talk about why we wanted to create this in the first place and what the intention was. So sure. Why did you want to do this?
Yeah, there's a few different reasons. The first one was we were going to have this launch, and we wanted it to kind of be a primer of the work we had done today and the work we wanted to do in the future. And, you know, white papers or reports like this are typically very important credibility building kind of pieces or mechanisms for the work that we're going to do in the future as a resource organization via the Institute. So that was really one of the motivating factors. And the other motivating factor was we had done 75 plus podcast episodes at that point, which was definitely 80, 90 plus hours of content. And we had written all these blog recaps. We had all these conversations. And so we had hundreds of hours of content and many, many insights, but we had not distilled that down into some sort of format where it was all summarized and synthesized in a readable document. So we're not recreating the wheel here. This has been done a billion times by a billion other people, but it was time for us at this stage of all the content we had created to kind of create a document like this that could serve as that summary mechanism. And someone doesn't have to listen to 100 hours of podcasts to get to the insights. And the third thing that I didn't expect to get out of it, that I think we got out of it in spades, was really going through the process provided an additional level of clarity and coherence for us internally as to the work we wanted to do and the things we really needed to focus on that we had to some meaningful degree, but I think made it even sharper. So those were the three big kind of motivating factors and or outcomes of it for sure.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. And I think in particular, like this document as a resource, we have a group of listeners and they follow along. So they might not get as much value out of this, but if somebody new just wants to get into regenerative CPG and they don't want to listen to 75 episodes of a podcast to try to extract all the value, this is such a cool consolidated document where they can spend, maybe 30 minutes reading this and pulling all of the key threads out of those episodes, and not only just getting that value from the individual episodes, but to have it broken down and say like, hey, in this specific piece of nutrient density, that's referred to in these 7 different episodes very specifically. And we take that value and we kind of put it in the right place first. I'm really not saying what I want to say. It's like, it's summarized in the right way. Man, I'm really not saying it the way I want to.
Maybe you're looking for a more eloquent way to just say something that's simple, which is it serves as that really good summary document, like you said. And, for us, we have to find ways to get this information as concise as possible in front of very time-starved decision makers. And so at the very least, if someone just downloads the report and reads the executive summary pages and the list of how brands are winning today and the major challenges, they read those 3 pages, they would have a very much increased understanding of the state of the industry. And we have a very unique opportunity, and I think we both feel responsibility. There's not really another unifier, harmonizer, aggregator in the space because of the division with the different types of claims and because it's a bunch of different individual brands like really leading the charge. So, it was our job to go synthesize that chaos a little bit and create something that was more approachable and understandable.
Yeah, totally agree.
And hopefully we can do more of it in the future. I mean, the plan is to recreate a version of this on an annual basis. We'll see how that goes. I mean, we're a young startup nonprofit, so plans are always changing, but that is the plan, to release kind of the V2 next year in 2025. So we'll see how that goes. But sounds like it's time to dive into the content. What do you think, partner?
Yeah, I think you're right. I was just going to ask, like as this report was being built or once it was finalized, what were some of the most interesting topics? I guess topics is the wrong word. Value sets, surprises that popped up for you that you're like, whoa, that's really interesting.
There wasn't too much that was super surprising because it all was, it was all sourced from work we had already done and conversations we had already had. It was really interesting to have pattern recognition that you and I had synthesized like qualitatively, but then when we put the report together, we actually marked like the amount of brands that have shown this insight or shown this takeaway or demonstrated this possibility or had this problem. Like it really validated like these things are very real. And we have the data to back it up because it's been mentioned 50 times on 85 of the episodes or whatever that was. Mm-hmm. I found it interesting from also the standpoint that, it created social accountability. Like we have published what we believe the problems and opportunities are. So now we're accountable to saying, what have we done to go fix them? And in a way, that's a really good for an organization like ours, because I think we can get distracted with a lot of bright, shiny objects. And we're certainly trying to do a lot. But we now have a roadmap or almost a scorecard to come back to on an annual basis and say, hey, this was something we had momentum in. Have we maintained that momentum? Hey, this was something that needed a solution. Have we implemented any sort of solution? And if we have, How is it better than it was last year or the last 5 years or whatever? So that was something I didn't expect it to create as much, that I'm really happy it has, because super beneficial to our work and just our ability to serve our key stakeholders, which is obviously the most important thing we always need to be thinking about.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. When you articulate the problem, it's almost like you have a responsibility to try to find the solution.
Yeah.
Um, and that is an interesting byproduct. I didn't even think about that, but it's a big part of the work we're doing now in the coalition and the institute, right? It's like, okay, now we've clearly identified these problems. Can we focus on the top three and really try to move the needle and create some potential solutions for these issues?
Mm-hmm. Amen. Yeah, I mean, we've said it before many times, and I've said it in a lot of these interviews of press opportunities we've had post-launch. It's like we just uncovered problems we couldn't look away from, and we felt like we had to try and do something to help solve them. It's really that simple at the end of the day. And this document, I think, really created an additional level of clarity that's been super beneficial to have. So let's dive into this thing. For those that haven't taken a look at it, like I said, we'll drop it as the first link in the show notes. It's available to download for sure. We broke it down mostly into two big sections. The first section was called How ReGen Brands Are Winning Today, and there were 9 kind of major takeaways or themes for that one. And then the second section was Key Challenges and Calls to Action, which had 6 major takeaways or themes. So we're just going to spend some time going through each one of those and riffing on each and giving you all a breakdown of each one.
Should I just kick it off with number 1? And just start at 0, I guess. The first one, and this is broken down so clearly and so well in the report. So again, shout out to all of our partners who helped us put this together. But regenerative brands are bringing increased value to farmers and providing price premiums and additional technical and financial support to farmers who are looking to transition. So that's number 1. I think it really is one of the most important things, because at the end of the day, like, why are we doing this? Why are we so focused on regenerative CPG? And it's all about implementing regenerative practices on more acres of arable land, right? So if supporting regenerative CPG helps to get more arable land transitioned to regenerative practices, like, that's the end goal. So what were your key takeaways in that section?
Yeah, a few things to build on that. I mean, I think where we've gotten to understanding the economic realities of these enterprises is a couple things. The 101 takeaway has always been the brand pays the farmer a premium, which allows them to implement or sustain the practices. Yes, I think most people know that at this point. The deeper level I felt like we got to there was, if regenerative practices don't lead to greater or sustaining on-farm profitability, like, this thing is dead in the water. And so it was interesting to uncover more and more examples of that. And so the biggest takeaway here is, like, regenerative has to be a better economic opportunity for the farmer to make this happen, and brands are a key lever to ensure that. A couple other things were, we have all these really cool, countless examples of people building really equitable, fair supply chains in the global South, and then using the American market to increase the economic opportunity for those farmers. So I thought that was interesting. And then the other big kind of thematic example was, we have countless examples now of folks in the meat brands that are aggregating, creating processing, creating brands, creating market access for a bunch of medium, small, large regenerative ranchers specifically, that maybe if they had to all go direct to consumer on their own, or they had to figure out some sort of other route to market, they wouldn't have as profitable or even a profitable channel at all. So tons of really cool examples of really how these brands are bringing increased value to farmers, for sure.
Totally agreed. I just want to touch on one specific episode, which it still blows my mind, and I've probably talked about it numerous times. It's the Verde Farms episode, when they start implementing their rotational grazing patterns with these farmers who have been doing, free range pasture raised cattle, but not with the high stock density grazing methods. And one of the coolest pieces of feedback we heard on that episode was, when one of these ranchers in South America, like you mentioned, started implementing rotational grazing, it took less time for his cattle to make weight, because the enrichment of the soil was so dramatic that the nutrient density of the grass that the cattle were consuming helped them put on weight faster, healthy weight. And the movement helped them build lean muscle. Like, That's the type of value this sort of stuff can provide to these smallholder farmers. And I think that's just such a powerful example of these people who have been raising cattle for, I mean, centuries, if not, maybe centuries is wrong, maybe it's decades, if not centuries.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's just really powerful to see that sort of an example and that sort of value being brought to these folks.
Yeah, the increasing of the grass nutrient density, but also just the general availability of it, right? And the fact that that could get the cattle to slaughter faster and affect rancher profitability and economics, like amazing. And we have countless examples now of regenerative systems that are doing that, and the brand being the off taker is a key kind of linchpin in making that happen. So yeah, love number one. I'll take us up for number two, which was regenerative product innovation creates markets that boost biodiversity. What were your big takeaways on that one?
Yeah, the first things that come to mind there are when there are like Dr. Bronner's, when they start working with regenerative, coconut oil or whatever else they're looking for. And they start to realize that these regenerative systems require biodiversity on farm, and
Mm-hmm.
they can create markets for those same farmers that they're already working with and offtake that. And that's why they started making chocolate bars, because I think it was coconut oil or maybe it was olive or palm. I can't remember which oil it was, paired really well in a regenerative system with cacao beans. So originally, I think Dr. Bronner's was trying to find the right partner to offtake that ancillary crop, and they're like, why don't we just make chocolate bars?
Mm-hmm.
So they did, and I think those sorts of partnerships and the potential power of those kind of 1-2 combos, where it's like, hey, we're not just going to buy this major commodity from you, we're also going to support your regenerative initiatives and
Mm-hmm.
increase your biodiversity and give you those markets and pay you a premium for them. That's super super powerful, and I think that's going to be one of the keys to decommoditizing the system and developing those stronger relationships between brands and farmers.
Yeah, 100%. And it really felt like the value adds that, or the value add that brands were bringing in this one was one of two potential options. They were either ensuring a greater diversity of offtake for the farmer, right? So I grow 5 things and I can only sell 3 right now. Let me sell you the fourth and fifth also, or create a more stable, more profitable market for the fourth and fifth. So creating additional revenue streams for the farmer and also greater offtake of biodiverse growing systems. And then there's also all these underutilized or non-traditional crops that these brands are creating markets for, like we had with Zach's Mighty and the Flint corn, like with Pacha and Lil Bucks with what they're doing with buckwheat, tons of other examples as well. But at the end of the day, the linchpin to making all of that happen was every brand had the farmer and biodiversity and the farm ecosystem at the table in product development. So it was a strategic part of all those decisions that was then affecting all these amazing outcomes in terms of farmer livelihoods and biodiversity on farm.
Yeah, and to your point earlier, if this is not economically viable or like at least same or better than conventional farming, it's never going to work. And this
Mm-hmm.
is another one of those perfect examples of like how can this be more beneficial to the farmer? It's like, hey, implement this practice and don't just let it die. We will buy it back from you, and increase the value of our partnership. So
Mm-hmm.
I think those are great examples. Number 3 in the executive summary, and this is a super fun one to talk about, is that regenerative products are insanely delicious. The proof is quite literally in the pudding, but I think it's important to acknowledge and talk about, some of what we covered in some of the episodes. So what were your big takeaways there?
Yeah. I mean, this one kind of speaks for itself. It probably doesn't need to be unpacked a ton, but we have just countless examples of where brands are winning with flavor, which is super important. And it's something that's never going to go away. We know flavor is always going to matter. Taste is always going to matter. And I like the way that Dr. James Richardson talks about it in the book Ramping Your Brand, of like the entire sensory experience. I actually think we get a little too caught up in taste and flavor when it's about the entire sensory experience of the product, and flavor is the bedrock of that. But it's funny. I feel like the poster child for me for this one has become Alex Ice Cream. I'm an investor. I'm a huge fan. I love ice cream. I feel like I've talked about it a lot, but it's not only regenerative organic A2 dairy that doesn't upset my stomach, which is part of the sensory experience and very important, but it's the best ice cream I've ever had. And like that is why consumers are resonating with that product. And it is an amazing gateway into getting them to care about regenerative.
I think you're spot on there. Big fan of Alex as well, especially their lemon, whatever their lemon one they dropped recently, man, is unreal.
I haven't had that one
Um,
yet.
oh my god, it's so good. But there's two other brands I want to spotlight. In particular, I think Zach's Mighty is one that really comes to mind because
Hmm.
in Zach's pursuit of creating, I might misquote this, but the best performing chip in guacamole, something to that
Yeah.
effect.
Yeah.
Um, it led him to regenerative agriculture. He wasn't trying to be a regen brand initially, but in his relentless pursuit for premium performance and flavor, he ended up going towards regenerative agriculture. And I think that's a really great story. And it's such a huge, powerful aisle to have somebody like him leading the charge. I think it's fantastic. Another one that comes to mind is Long Table Pancakes. I
Mm.
guess Long Table, comma, their pancake line. Um, with their ancient grains, stone ground, they're again pursuit of flavor, and then realizing they
Yeah.
also have the potential benefit to impact the planet is just really really cool. So,
Yeah.
um, I love that part of regenerative ag and regen CPG is that you don't have to be trying to save the planet. You can be solely focused on taste and flavor and still
Hmm.
end up in the regenerative, side of the arena.
Hmm. And it seems like in at least regen circles, there's enough general knowledge that regenerative practices equal nutrient density, which equals tastier food, right? There's a lot of stuff we got to go do to prove all the science and get that really into mainstream consciousness. But a piece that we had uncovered and seen as a very clear theme over a lot of the time that I think is not talked about enough is so many of these brands have unique or proprietary processing methodologies, or they self-manufacture, which allows them to not lose the flavor enhancement that happens on the farm and really carry it all the way through the end product. And that's a key enabler that we probably don't talk about enough, right? Like that work to enhance flavor doesn't stop at harvest. It has to go through all the way the manufacturing process. And there's tons of examples of, brands that have been on the pod and brands in the regen universe that self-manufacture, have proprietary manufacturing techniques to enable that win at the end of the day.
I couldn't agree more, and I think that's another one of the cool parts of Regen CPG. And this sort of segues into number 4 when we start to talk about the health and wellness benefits, because these two are interlinked, very, very closely, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you're going to go through all of the arduous, difficult steps to create a product that is so superior in nutrition and flavor, the brands more than most other brands want to carry that through, right? They want
Mm-hmm.
it to continue to taste great. They want to make sure that it is as healthy as possible. And I think that's one of the big key unlocks for regen brands. They more often than not, might err towards using an avocado oil instead of a seed oil, or go with the stone ground older processing technique that is more beneficial for nutrient density transfer for human absorption. And
Mm-hmm.
me, somebody who really cares about my health and is very intentional about what I put in my body, that is such a huge win. And it makes it so much easier to pick up and buy and consume a regen brand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it goes against the myth that like healthy food tastes like shit, which is not true.
Totally.
So, fourth takeaway: regenerative products win over consumers with health and wellness benefits. Like Kyle said, very linked to the taste and flavor stuff. I mean, there's countless brands that are really showing that they have the healthiest or a healthier option in the category, and they're driving a lot of growth with that. And then they're educating consumers on the back end that comes from regenerative agriculture, and that's a huge factor in that. Um, in the conversation we had with Ryan and what he believes and what we believe about the future of nutrient density, like we really do believe this is the gold standard, the winning strategy. If we can unlock it, it will make a huge difference. So, I know for myself, like the amount of ancestral blend packs of force of nature bison and beef I've consumed over the last 2 years, and it's a really easy, simple way for me to just add those organ meats into my diet. And so it's not necessarily just about regenerative, but it's also about kind of bringing back ancient wisdom of nutrition and the fact that those organs and the beef were farmed regeneratively in our nutrition powerhouses.
I mean, absolutely spot on. I like to. So a lot of people when they go to like parties or something, they'll make food and bring it. I like buy a regen brand and bring it, and then we all talk
Yeah.
about it.
Yeah.
And some of the brands I love to buy to showcase like that flavor difference and then
Mm-hmm.
the level of cleanliness are really like Big Picture Foods olives.
Mm-hmm.
Olives in general have such a punch you in the face sort of like flavor profile, and Big Picture is almost like 2 punches instead of one.
Mm-hmm.
And I really like to tell that story about how the brine is the same brine that they're dropped in on the farm and it's just carried over instead of like the citric acid and the flash pasteurization or whatever that they use. Daniela's probably going to hate me for botching that. But that one, and then I think Little Sesame's like spun hummus and how much
Yeah.
smoother it is. You know, people, these are foods that people eat on a somewhat regular basis, maybe less so with olives, but you can really
Mhm.
taste the difference in the quality, not just because of the crop or the olive or the garbanzo bean, but
Mhm.
because of the way they make it and the level of care that goes into it all throughout the entire process. So, super, super important to let people know that, hey, to your point earlier, AC, this is really delicious food that is better for you and better for the planet. And that is going to have to be the unlock
Mhm.
if this is ever really going to take off.
Yeah, and I think I find it very interesting to think about how the health and wellness benefits are affecting a product very differently based on the category. Like, is the person buying ice cream or olives or hummus really as concerned as like the person buying grass finished beef or bison? Right? Like, that's the latter is a much more nutritionally minded decision for someone like me. I'm just speaking like personally. But if we have this data across all the categories and products, what's that going to mean for like the consumer of 2030 or 2040, depending on when that all kind of starts shaking out? And I think we probably don't talk about enough, especially on the regenerative organic side and even the regenerative side, where there's a vast decrease in chemical usage. Nutrition is not just what's in the product and the nutrition benefits, but also what's not in the product, like glyphosate and other agrochemicals. And I think that still matters a ton if someone's buying ice cream, olives, or hummus versus maybe that it has more vitamin B in it. So that's another thing that I think is important for us to just think about as we build this consumer messaging around taste, health, wellness, purity, lack of toxicity, etc.
You're totally right. And we'd be remiss not to mention Tim with Philosopher Foods during this section, who is so dedicated
Yeah.
into this nutrition side with
Mm-hmm.
his regenerative organic sprouted fermented almonds, which are absolutely insane.
Mm-hmm.
I actually have to hide them from my wife because she craves them so often. She'll crush a whole bag, so I have to like sparingly like take a bag out and put it in the pantry.
Yeah.
But and I think, like you mentioned, not every consumer is going to be so focused on nutritional density, especially in different categories. But in my own experience, in my own health journey, what I have noticed is that the more nutrient dense, clean, intentional food I consume, the more I crave that type of food, and the less appealing highly processed food becomes.
Yeah.
And maybe that's just me. I don't know if you can speak to that in your experience, but
Mm-hmm.
I no longer have the same taste or appetite for a lot of foods that I used to consume because and maybe it's subconscious or maybe it's I don't know, but I really feel
Mm-hmm.
like I crave like fermented foods and like the gut nuts. I crave those, unlike I've
Mm-hmm.
craved food before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I share that, and it's almost for me, it's almost that the craving is definitely reduced, but also the like bad aftertaste or the after effect of
Mm,
those foods when I do have them very rarely is heightened and
for
worsened,
sure, yes.
um, which I feel like plays a big role into that.
Yeah, which is both a blessing and a curse. It's like, man, you
Yeah.
really get punished for those bad decisions, which keeps you further away from them. But like, if you're in an environment where you don't really have a lot of options, like, man, I'm going to pay for this down the road, you know?
Hmm. For sure. Yeah.
Well, let's jump into number five. This one is, Regenerative is inspiring a new class of young and diverse brand founders. I think this one's really cool and super well showcased on the pod, mainly due to your very intentional curation of our guests. So kudos to you. But talk to us a little bit about that one.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're really blessed in we're very intentional about it, but we don't need to try incredibly hard to have a diverse founder cohort join this podcast because the people working on regenerative agriculture are diverse. It could always be improved, but the amount of women-led or women-owned companies that we've spotlighted, the amount of BIPOC or LGBTQ founders and or executives we've had on, I think is really key. I don't know why I don't have the stats readily in front of me, but they're in the report, and they're both very good, and they're very not aligned with what you would typically see in kind of a business setting of representation. So I know we're very proud of that, but I also think it's just a credit to the greater mission that these people are trying to serve. And it's funny to go through them now in this way together for the first time and see how all of these takeaways seem so linked, because one of the interesting things, and I can't remember if Katie quantified it in the report or not, because I'm not looking at that page, but the amount of entrepreneurs that started a brand because of a health issue for themselves or a family member, like it's a lot of the interviews we've done. It's a lot of the brands that we know in this space. And so
I would venture more than half. What do you think?
That might be strong. It's definitely more than half if you like bridge it out to just an awareness of the human health crisis, right? Inclusion, but the visceral, personal, and or family experience, I don't know if it's half, but it's up there. It's not 10, and it's not 20. It's like more than that, which, I wish we didn't have to go through that to make stuff like this happen. But it is nice that it's a positive outcome of those life experiences. Like, I mean, you and I both share. So just interesting takeaway.
Totally, man. And I almost feel like I shouldn't bring this up, but from a TAM perspective, total addressable market, like there are so many other people in this country who are dealing with these issues.
Mm-hmm.
And not that we want to like, hey, let people get sick so they can find regenerative products. Like we certainly don't want that outcome, but that is a very possible outcome. And if we can provide people with not just the knowledge and the information, but the actual tangible good that can improve their life, that's phenomenal, right?
Mm-hmm.
We would prefer them to consume these products before they get sick, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's great that, once you have had an experience like that, your own health experience, I think it's kind of hard to go back. So it's potentially beneficial for all these brands that they're providing this potential solution for everyone who's suffering these, ranging from terminal illness to, not to diminish an autoimmune disease, but like, it runs the whole gamut, and people suffering from any of these issues are going to want to try to find this type of food.
Yeah, and we have some real powerhouse serial entrepreneurs that are very committed to regenerative, which I think is a great indicator of what this thing means. Like we got Jordan and Ancient Nutrition, we got the crew at Force of Nature that came from Epic. I'm sure there's a couple others I'm forgetting, but that's meaningful. And I think that's also meaningful to the rest of the industry that, oh, you're doing your second or third thing and it's like all about regenerative. Tell me more about that. Why is that so motivating? Like, why is that such a central pillar? So just really cool to see people overcome those health obstacles, people so committed to regenerative. And then we also have people bringing in deep elements of their personal experience and or various international cultures that I think is super cool and very on trend with how, the cuisine in this country is getting much more multicultural. So yeah, lots of cool stuff there.
Totally agree. And I did flip to the page, so I think it's an important stat to share. And again, you get the credit here. The ReGen Brands podcast, I think we've had 43 of our 92 guests representing at least one underrepresented group, which is 47%. So that's massive. And to your point, it wasn't incredibly difficult to make that happen because there is such a diverse group and kind of leading the charge here, which is really cool to see.
Hell yeah. All right, number 6 for how ReGen Brands are winning today is regenerative brands drive retailer and consumer awareness, which is essential for the regenerative movement. This will be a fun one and very corresponding to a couple in the challenges section. So what do you think about this one, brother?
Yeah, so I looked up this stat the other day, and this is a ChatGPT stat. Stat. So take it with a grain of salt. But I was just curious, like, what does food consumption by sector look like in the U.S.? 5 to 10% of all food is consumed at schools and hospitals. 15% is fast food. 20% restaurants, and 60% is purchased at the grocery store. Right. So that is a hugely important sector of where, hands down, 3-1 lead over the next closest. Food is bought and consumed from grocery stores. And if we think about that and where people interact and intersect with food, there's not awareness in that area, that's a huge issue. So the ReGen Brands are driving all of that awareness right now. So it's a critically important channel. And I think, we have to do better as a movement to ensure that we're driving awareness the right direction. And there's a lot of opportunity in the space of retail. And now I kind of feel like I've gone down this rabbit hole that I don't know where to go from here. But I just wanted to identify why that's so critically important, why leading the charge in retail is so important.
Well, you're kind of diving into it in both the way that we're winning and in also teeing up the challenge. So agreed. And I'll like further resonate like the why it matters with, I spoke at Nosh Live, which is a industry event last week. So these are all mainly like better for you CPG people, and big room, big gathering of people, probably at least over 100. And I said, how many people have heard of regenerative agriculture? Every room and every hand in the room goes up. How many people can walk into the store and like go right to their favorite regenerative product and know what it is and buy it? Like 95% of the hands went down. Like, so that is the core issue, which is we still don't have the high level awareness of this term, and we still don't have the awareness of the individual products that have legit high integrity regenerative claims. And we don't have the linkage for consumers for, what to buy, why to buy them. But the way that we are winning today is we have some early momentum with some really great retailers like Sprouts, Whole Foods, NCG stores, infra stores, your natural retailers, natural grocers. They are
Jimbo's.
Really committed.
Got to throw Jimbo's on that list.
Jimbo's. There's tons of independents we could add to the list. Do we have the scaled, unified, programmatic execution we want at all those places? No, but we have some end caps here and there. We have some signage here and there. We have them prioritizing this in their assortments. Like those are wins, and those are big things that we can build off of. And yeah, I mean, we're just at this very unique point where all this is just starting to proliferate. So we have some early momentum with retailer preference, or at least prioritization. We have increased awareness of these certification schemes and these labels and these claims. And within the industry, evidenced by my opportunity to really speak and have a 20-minute solo interview slot last week at Nosh Live, is the industry is talking about it. Like in trade, it is being discussed. We had the Regenerate neighborhood at Newtopia now. Like there is a lot of momentum here, and there's a definite increased awareness at a high level. So what else you have to add to that, bro?
I think you're spot on. It's really difficult for me not to try to pivot to the opportunities and the more that we can do.
We will. We'll
yeah, I know. So it's just not the right time to do that. But I think you're correct. There's a lot of momentum. There have been some really cool partnerships, and it's great to see the brands wanting to collaborate. I think that's huge. And I think a lot of these brands understand that sort of rising tide raises all ships, regardless of, as long as we don't need to get into the different verifications and certifications, but the legit ReGen brands want all other legit ReGen brands to succeed, regardless of, certification or verification affiliation, which is really, really awesome.
Amen. Yeah, 100%. And there's this concept in the book is called the gain versus the gap, where it's like leads to a lot of psychological hardship to always just focus on the gap and never acknowledge the gain. And this is a good opportunity for us to acknowledge the gain and think back to like when we started this podcast in the summer of 2022, the level of discussion, awareness, clarity on these problems was, we are light years ahead of that now. And so it's just important to acknowledge like there has been some very critical wins in the space in terms of that. And some opportunities, which we'll talk about here in a little bit.
No doubt. I want to jump into number 7, which is Regenerative Brands Challenge Business as Usual.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this was a fun one, and there's this whole concept of regenerative thinking and regenerative business beyond just regenerative agriculture. And I love a lot of the work that people are doing in that space that I think originates mostly from Carol Sanford and a set of elders that have really passed down some really cool wisdom in that regard. But there's so many of these brands that are not just settling for we source from regenerative farms. They're building these regenerative principles into their businesses, and they're also finding new ways to commercialize these products that are different. Like the proliferation of some of these brands that are really focused on food service or direct to consumer e-commerce versus just retail. And some of the brands like what Tree Rage Farms and Soul Simple have set up with these multi-layered, multi-entity corporate structures that are delivering so much, not only regenerative ecological benefit, but like social equity benefit to their stakeholders and their farmers and the places that they live. Like just really cool. And it's just super impressive.
Agree with everything you shared. One of the episodes that really stands out to me is Kyle Kolar from Wildway.
Yeah.
When I think about somebody who's trying to challenge business as usual, like he is the epitome of that in my mind.
Yeah.
And
Just
he
look
does
at his
really good.
LinkedIn posts
Yeah,
every day.
I was just gonna say he does a great job of
Yeah.
articulating that during the episode, and highly
Yeah.
recommend following him on LinkedIn because he's consistently posting about some of the, I don't know what the term is, but we'll call them common problems in the industry and why
Hmm.
the food industry is so backwards and why it's so difficult to be a brand that's not just, to your point, Anthony, trying to source regenerative ingredients, but trying to be like a different type of entity and to do business
Hmm.
differently.
Hmm.
So I think he embodies that spirit better than anyone that comes to mind for me.
Yeah, and I really appreciate Kyle's leadership in his capacity to challenge the hypocrisy of some of the things that we do in this industry and a lot of the powerful people and entities that say things, but they operate in the exact antithetical way every single day.
Mm-hmm.
That's not hard to do. And I know he's even faced some adverse consequences from some of the things already. So, yeah, big shout out to him for holding the line there and the countless other examples of people that are really trying to. I think that John Kemp has this like very well repeated quote in regenerative that regenerative is ultimately about rebuilding relationships and it's about regenerative relationships, and that means it's about people. And yes, it's about farms, it's about crops, it's about animals, but it's ultimately also about the people. And just lots of examples of brands that are putting people first across their entire businesses, which I think lead to some of these more regenerative business and agricultural outcomes.
Totally agree. I was going to try to get into this whole thing about how like people is just part of life and it's regeneration is about
Let
the
it
whole
rip, bro. Love it.
No, I can't. The flow's gone. Break us down. Get us into the next one.
Number 8, which I also have already just talked about as we discussed number 7, is Regenerative Brands pioneer new routes to market, which is really like retail's not the only route. We have this excellent work going on in direct-to-consumer e-commerce and food service and other sales channels. And then there's also some really cool examples of brands leveraging existing infrastructure or creating in-person experience to really connect with consumers.
Yeah, I really think the food service play that you've touched on a couple times now is really, really interesting. Not that that's a super safe place to play. It's still definitely high risk. And as we discussed earlier, 20% of food consumed in the United States comes from restaurants.
Mm-hmm.
35 if you include fast food.
Mm-hmm.
It might not have as much impact, but one of the trends that we've picked up numerous times is that brands who can start or at least play in food service earlier helps them meet some economies of scale. And that profitability from that sector can help to drive some of the growth in retail, which is a larger
Mm-hmm.
total addressable market. So I think that was a personal, like really unique learning and doing all these different podcasts. And I think it's really cool to lay that out because as somebody's coming to market with a particular brand, if you can think about how to address food service at the same time, it could give you, I don't know what the right term is here, man. I'm struggling today with words, which is tough when you're recording a podcast. But it could really give you an advantage and some level of stability for your business to help to fund some of that growth you need in retail, which is quite expensive.
Yeah, people are building really nice economies of scale and better cash flow kind of turns in that channel, and then using that to help fund retail growth, which is typically much harder to achieve both of those in. So 100%. And I think there's been this really cool example set by a lot of these brands that we've interviewed that are the true pioneers in this space where they have a super open door policy with their farms, especially if they're vertically integrated or if they're direct trade, where any customer, any supplier, any retailer, any distributor can come visit anytime and really see, touch, feel, smell. We've talked about this before, but like when you see a regenerative farm, when you're on a regenerative farm, there's just this visceral experience that you can't turn away from. I don't know how we replicate that to the tune of millions of consumers. We probably can't, but it's gotten to the point where we haven't had White Oak Pastures on yet, but we definitely will. But I'm sitting there in Indianapolis at my little nephew's basketball game, and a guy standing next to me randomly's got a White Oak Pastures hat on, and I'm like, "Hey man, just curious, like, how do you know about White Oak?" And he's like, "Oh, like I heard about him on Rogan. We buy their product. We drove to Florida for spring break, and we stopped in Bluffton on the way there."
Wow.
And I'm just like, man, that is really cool. And like the Alexanders, and there's many others that I think there's a key group of not only just consumers, but retailer partners that have been to these farms now. And there's something that we can't fully quantify about that human experience, but it's going to pay dividends. And I think it's really helping us get the momentum that we have in this whole regenerative thing.
I think you're so spot on with that, like farm visit loyalty. And what's so cool about regenerative agriculture is you can have that farm affiliation associated with the brand. Whereas, I've been to a handful of regenerative farms in my life, and most of them I can't attach a brand to it.
Yeah.
There's CSAs or there's something else, and it's like, yeah, cool, I can go support that. But if I'm visiting California, like I can't really support that unless I'm there.
Yeah.
So to be able to carry that through at a regionally or nationally available brand is so powerful. And we're totally off topic on this, but it's worth acknowledging. Like, how do we get people to have that experience? And to me, it really is like a borderline Netflix series where people are going farm to farm.
Yeah.
They represent brands and showing people like this is the level of intentionality, the quality, and the difference that this particular farm is making. And this is how you can continue to support it in your local grocery store on a regular basis. And it meets that convenience factor for the consumer as well. And I think that could be such a powerful, long format storytelling piece of media that can really make an impact for the entire movement if we can figure out how to pull that off.
Yeah, I think there's a huge opportunity there. So whoever knows Netflix and wants to get us a Netflix deal, please help us out. We will happily host the show. There's also some really cool examples of people, I think, spreading the word mainly on LinkedIn or within the trade from a B2B perspective of like, this is what real regenerative blank looks like. I think of a couple of people specifically, like what Paul Grieve does with showing their mobile coops moving around all the time. And then also like calling out fake pasture raised meat and eggs. I'm like, hell yeah, Paul, love that. And then I think what Heather Terry and the team at Good Sam have done around their level of transparency and some of the content they create when they visit their farms in Colombia and Kenya and other places. It's like, man, this is what it really looks like to do direct trade the right way in an equitable fashion. This is what regenerative agriculture and the people, the farmers like involved really look like. I think many others as well, but those are a couple of examples that like really cool content coming out of both of those folks.
Yeah, I think we should call them LinkedIn legends. It should be like a term. I want to add Lad Wall into that group. He's doing some really cool stuff with like potato farming, and every time I see one of his posts, I'm learning, which is so cool. So I appreciate everybody sharing what they do on LinkedIn. Great platform to share this stuff.
Yeah, cool. Well, take us home with this last one for this group.
Yeah. So last one, number 9 for the how are ReGen Brands winning today is regenerative brands prove that regenerative agriculture can feed the world. This is obviously so important to talk about. It's one of the immediate like, oh no, but ReGen Ag can't feed the world. It's like, well, maybe it can. So AC, tell us what we've learned about that through this process.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've learned that like we feed the world is just a lie that conventional agriculture and big business like props up to maintain the status quo. And we have all these examples of brands achieving better on-farm profitability, actually higher yields versus lower yields, more nutrition. So it's like more nutrition per calorie. There's all these things where it's like, hey, the math doesn't really check out the way that you're telling us it checks out. And obviously super diverse conversation based on different crops, geographies, socioeconomic, factors. But, we have these examples where we have big scaled brands like a Lundberg moving major amounts of product. We have super scaled or significantly scaled internationally sourcing rice brand like Lotus Foods. We have Applegate committing to the amount of meat that they've committed to for their hot dog portfolio by like 2025 or whatever it is. Like these are not small numbers that are going to come from, certified or verifiable regenerative supply chains. And I think that's super important.
Yeah. I think Kettle on Fire, we've now committed, I think it was originally 1 million pounds of regenerative bones, and now it's up to 1.5 by 2026.
Let's go.
So that's a lot of bones. We're really excited about that. So I just want to, shout out to Kettle on Fire. But another thing, and this, 40% of food consumed or grown in the United States ends up being wasted anyways, right? Like this, to your point, this like lie that we've all been fed that like regenerative ag can't feed the world or it has to be conventional is just another symptom of we're not really addressing the real problem here. There's so many different ways to fix the food system. From a food waste perspective, from a how food is grown perspective, from a processing perspective, from a transportation and logistics perspective. All that to say, like ReGen can absolutely feed the world. and
Mhm.
not only feed the world in terms of like calorie, if you're going to break it down in its most like, binary form, it can actually do better to feed the world by utilizing water the right way. To your point on
Mm.
nutritional density, maybe feeding people less calories but more nutrition. And for me, it really does still feel like the original. I don't want to call it a silver bullet, but one of the greatest potential solutions to solve a number of different myriad of problems that are facing humanity today. So
Mhm.
yeah, still bullish on regen ag. Not a shocker
Yeah.
there.
Shocking to hear these two gentlemen say these things.
Right.
Um, oh yeah. Cool. Well, if people want to unpack those even more, there's even more amazing content that Katie helped lead the charge on putting together in the actual report. So go download it. But we will move to the key challenges and calls to action section now, which we have 6 of those. And I think it's important to read kind of this little header or subtitle section for this. It still remains incredibly challenging for brands to succeed in a system that is not structured to support regenerative supply chains. In this section of the report, we call it the sticky challenges that regenerative brands face and our thoughts on how brands in the wider industry can promote creative solutions. So that's really the theme of these 6. Number 1, kicking us off, is regenerative is not and will not be the main reason why a consumer buys a product. What do you think about that one?
Yeah, we cover this, I think, on just about every single episode of the podcast in some degree or another. And I've referenced this talk that we both attended at Expo West numerous times, but we were sitting there and Nielsen IQ or Nielsen was presenting some syndicated shopper data that they had. And it was like, what are the drivers for purchase? And I think number 1 was price, number 2 was taste, number 3 was convenience. And then all the way down, number 8 on that list it wasn't even regenerative. It was like altruistic benefit or something along
Yeah.
those lines.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's really important to discuss because I think maybe less so today than 2 years ago. But leading with the term regenerative is just not a winning formula. What
Mm-hmm.
do consumers care about? Is like, how is this good for me? Number 1, does it taste good? Number 2, or maybe those are flip flop depending on who you're talking to.
Mm-hmm.
And then if there is an altruistic benefit, like great, but that's not going to create a ton of purchase.
Mm-hmm.
And we've seen this time and time again from, almost every episode we've talked about. But as a movement, we have yet to really nail that. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that's one of the biggest unlocks is like as a movement, if we can figure out how to convey that message properly, that focusing on taste and nutrition are really like what regenerative brands are doing, that can help to scale this thing.
Yeah, I think it's so funny to think back to those initial like meetings you and I had in the initial conversations and podcast recordings we had when we both lived in Bend in 2022. And maybe this is more me than you, but I remember thinking about this from such a activism standpoint. Like we need to go get all the consumers to care about this and to care about all these altruistic benefits. And how are we going to solve for that? Right. And that was like really how our thinking and questioning was sitting then. And we've now gone through this phase of like, okay, that's not going to work, or that's really capped at a very small minority of consumers, no matter how successful it is, which we believe is the case. And so how do we get like a mainstream consumer to care about this? And it's important to know that looks different for an individual brand based on their products and their regenerative system and how they market that, and what we need to do to create like a unified messaging or toolkit as a regenerative movement about all things that are regenerative. But ultimately we have to like denial is the first phase and then acceptance is the second one. And we need to accept that it's not going to be the leading reason why anyone really ever buys a product outside of a very small minority. And we have to start designing a solution with that in mind. And I think the 2 real nice pieces of clarity that we've had over the last quarter or so that broke it down in a very easy to understand way to me were, we in the regenerative movement have spent way too much time on definitions and defining things to consumers. And we need to move to marketing something to a consumer. So like that's one big switch we need to make. And the other big switch is what you already alluded to, is we've spent way too much time trying to sell altruistic benefits that are really not tangible to the individual person. And we need to start selling self-interested benefits that are very tangible to the individual person consuming the product.
I think you're spot on. And I think it's worth calling out like maybe why there's such a friction here. And
Mm.
when you think about a lot of these regenerative founders, they are so pumped up about regeneration
Hmm.
internally, and that's what's driving them. And they want their consumers to want that same thing like they do, but
Yeah.
it's not there yet. So it's
Hmm.
difficult to tell somebody like, "Hey, I started this brand because of like I'm as guilty or more than anybody."
Right.
Like, oh, I started this brand because I wanted to sequester more water and increase the water holding capacity on X number of acres of land. It's like, oh, but that's not going to capture the consumer, you
Hmm.
know?
Hmm.
Um, so I think that's one of the tensions here and why it's difficult for some of the founders to focus on the taste and the nutrition aspect rather than
Hmm.
the regeneration and the power that regeneration can have for planetary health. So just worth acknowledging. It's an interesting problem that we have. But I think that based on recent conversations with everybody in our constituency, our cohort,
Hmm.
it will end up going this way. And we just got to figure out like how to nail the messaging to a very broad audience.
Hmm. Amen. And it's funny you mentioned the word tension because that's a good segue into our next one, which definitely interplays with the first one, which is regenerative product claims are contentious within the industry and confusing to consumers.
And when you say regenerative product claims, like this can mean a couple of different things. So let's specify: is this like how the product is grown from a regenerative perspective, or are these the claims you're making on the product after the fact?
The latter, the second one.
Okay. Yeah, this is. I think that you should speak to this one because you've done some research on like the nutrient density claim and how we can use that. So, what did you learn in that process?
Well, the bigger thing is like we have all these competing definitions and certification programs, and that's very divisive within the industry. So it's part of the problem why all the hands go up for being aware of the term, and all the hands go down when you're trying to take action in the aisle, right? And we've talked to, I feel like all the leading retailers at this point, and they all say the same thing, which is like this thing's really hard to wrap our arms around and support in an efficient way because what's the biggest difference between regenerative and every other claim that has been meaningful? It's not binary. Every other claim is yes or no. Every other claim is black and white. You're organic or you're not. You're non GMO or you're not. You're keto friendly or you're not. You're gluten free or you're not. Regenerative is you're regenerative in this way, which maybe everyone doesn't even agree with, or whatever it is, because we have 6, 7 different certification programs. We have uncertified brands with legit claims. We have uncertified brands with unlegit claims. So there's a unique opportunity within the industry to unify and have some success and better collaborate. And there's also this necessity for someone or a group of people to be mediators of some degree to create some harmony within a lot of chaos and division right now. And ultimately, what everyone needs to understand and face up with, which is what I feel like a lot of the group, a lot of the crew hides from, is this is harming our ability to engage the consumer. And that's at the end of the day, that is all that matters. If you want your program to be successful, if you want the brand to be successful, if you want the farmer to be successful, if you want the product to be successful in terms of making a regenerative claim, if we cannot properly engage the consumer, none of it matters.
Extraordinarily well said. And I think it reminds me of a movie. Let's find our common ground. Instead
Mm,
of all these disparate organizations focusing on the small things that make them different, let's focus on what's the 80% that all of these organizations are doing that make it
mhm,
100 times better than conventional extractive industrial ag.
mhm,
Can we find that common ground and say,
mhm,
okay, we all believe in this? That's going to be our leading market claim or hook or whatever to get retailers and consumers on board and blow up the awareness and get people to start to buy our products to solve the problem you answered for earlier. When somebody can walk into a store, they can find a regenerative product and they know what it means and they know why it's
mhm,
better for them and they know why it's better for the planet and they know why it's going to taste better.
mhm.
If we can solve for that one thing, to me, that's the biggest unlock for getting consumers on board, which at the end of the day will transition more arable land towards regenerative practices.
Right.
So can't overstate the importance of figuring that piece out.
Yeah, and the second step after what you just said very well is we have to codify it in some way. Like that is the issue right now, is like we have not given mainly the retailers, but these very important stakeholders that interface with the consumer, we have not given them the right tools, even if we had that consensus, to go engage the consumer with, right? And so that's what we're trying to help do in some capacity, is not only reach that consensus and get that 80%, but also codify it into some sort of process, systems, resources, tangible images, tangible messaging that can be used across the board, because we actually have to use those tools to engage people to reach that understanding.
Yeah. And hopefully we'll get there. We're I don't want to say making a ton of progress, but we're plugging away. I pictured like one of those ships that's like trudging through ice. That was the first image that came to my mind. So we're in that phase right now. But we could probably spend a ton of time talking about number two. So let's jump to number three. And some of the key challenges, which is regenerative brands invest in transforming supply chains without receiving proper incentives or rewards. I think this is critically important. So tell us some of the challenges or some of what we learned about this challenge during our episodes.
Yeah, basically the people supporting regenerative agriculture have increased cost and complexity, and there's very little and or no reward or incentive from distributors, retailers, and consumers at the end of the day for a lot of that work. Specifically, there is some premium pricing and increased margin realized, like if it's a premium product in a category that can support that pricing, but they're not getting credit for all this extra work they're doing. If anything, they're being taxed for that work that they're doing through increased needs to prove it transparently, increased needs to be certified, increased reporting, whatever, fill in the blank. So it's an issue, and it's one of those sticky challenges that people don't want to talk about. People love to kind of look away from and just say, hey, the brand and the farmer go figure out how to bring these regenerative products to market, and we're just going to do status quo. And we're having some success with that, but it's probably not good enough to get us where we really need to go at the end of the day.
Yeah, I very much agree. And there's a couple episodes that really stand out in my mind. And I think that this is particularly challenging for the non-meat regenerative producers out there. And I think about Oatman Farms, and I'm not trying to diminish the level of work that they put into creating their products, but what was striking to me about that episode, it was easier to start from zero than to transition. If you've got an existing industrial or ag or chemical farm and you're trying to get towards regenerative practices, not only are there no incentives or rewards until you've achieved some level of regenerative certification or verification, you're in this weird interim period where you've got to change your practices, which requires more capital, more training, more technical know-how. You're not going to get paid more. Your yields are going to decrease temporarily until you achieve the actual benefit of increased soil microbial activity. And it's a very, very slippery slope. And it's really hard. It's hard to get people to transition. And that's because these incentives are not structured the right way. I don't feel like I articulated that super well. Again, this is a struggle day. I don't know why. Maybe I had a bad breakfast.
Hey, you're doing great, man. You need to be a little bit nicer to yourself.
I appreciate that. But long story short, like transitioning is really, really hard. Yeah. And you're almost de-incentivized to transition unless you have a brand or some sort of a partner who's willing to prepay the premium before you've achieved the outcome. Right. And it's really difficult.
Yeah. And on top of that, like most of the brands we work with, the farm is already regenerative. So they've already gone through that transition. And now it's about, can they sustain and continue those practices? And the fundamental issue for many of these enterprises that support those farms, i.e. the brands, is there's not the proper economic incentive or reward to really help them do that in a easy way, right? They're clearly, a lot of them or all of them or most of them are doing that because they wouldn't be surviving as a business. But it's not fair or adequate, right? It's maybe like I'm giving $100 and getting 20 back, and it needs to be I'm giving $100 and getting $100 back in terms of like ROI. And we just have to continue to do the work to synthesize what those needs really are so that we can come up with some concrete asks for some of these other stakeholders and educate them why they should consider that and hopefully like agree to it. So that feels like the next steps I know that we're working on in terms of some of the work that we're doing just to continue to chip away at that.
Yeah, I agree. And it's like you mentioned it being a tax. these brands who are doing the right thing, who are doing it harder, who are paying people a fair wage, who are creating nutrient dense products, have to then pay for the certifications and verifications to prove that.
Hmm.
Whereas those using high fructose corn syrup on government subsidized, corn, and loaded with glyphosate, they don't have to pay for any certification. So it's cheaper to do it wrong. So to your point, like the whole incentive and reward system
Hmm.
is stacked against the farmers and the brands who are trying to do it the right way.
Yeah, it's funny. I think it was Heather at Good Sam who I heard talk about this before. But like, what if the grocery store had the opposite labeling paradigm than it does now? Like, basically, everything's about putting more stuff on the packaging the more good you're doing, instead of shouldn't we just label the shit about shouldn't we label the shit out of everyone doing all the bad stuff, and all the good stuff just gets to have nice, clean, pretty packaging?
Yeah.
It's a perfect example.
It is, and I think about apples, right? Like you buy an organic apple, sometimes there's a second sticker on there, one that says organic, and it's like the organic consumer probably doesn't want two stickers on their apple, you
Mm-hmm.
know. And it's just like the irony of the system that we live in today, which is it's frustrating. I don't know how we get to that point, but would love to get to Heather's world of. It almost makes me think of like how you market cigarettes in other countries. Have you ever seen
Right.
those?
Right. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't think it has to be that extreme if you have seen some of those images.
Mm-hmm.
But that concept should be applied to the US food system for sure.
Yeah. Well, this next one is totally your world, brother. So I want you to kick us off and dive in deep into it, but I'll just read it for us. But our fourth key challenge and call to action was regenerative products are priced at a premium and not widely accessible. Talk to us about that.
Yeah. This is a tough one. As we mentioned, there's a lot of things that make producing regenerative food really hard, right? And it's going to be more expensive. And generally, there's going to be a higher average retail price on regenerative products than their conventional counterparts for a ton of the reasons we've already discussed. And that's problematic for a variety of reasons. We do not want regenerative to become a small subset of land utilization. We're like, hey, some of this land is going to be regenerative and the rest is going to be bad. And then some products are going to be regenerative for like the ultra wealthy who can afford to be healthy. And then everybody else has to consume glyphosate and pesticide riddled food for the rest of their lives. So that's a huge challenge. So yeah, we talked about why brands have to be more expensive at times. Some regenerative brands have to cost more money because the system to grow the food requires more inputs and or labor. And it's going to be more expensive, especially because they have yet to reach economies of scale.
Mm-hmm.
That being said, there are a handful of brands out there who can create and bring a regenerative product to market at price parity for organic or non-GMO or gluten-free, or whatever other natural term you might want to attribute to that product. But because retailers have their own pricing systems and they want brands to fall into these buckets of good, better, and best, they will automatically qualify a regenerative product that has a claim as best. So they will take a higher margin on those specific products, which make it less accessible for people to consume regenerative. Pick the brand, pick the product. So that's another issue that is just sort of built into this US food system, and something that we're going to have to try to figure out how, I don't want to say break, but how we change and modify that, because we want regenerative products to be accessible. We want people to not have to pay a premium for regenerative olives or regenerative bone broth or regenerative tortilla chips. And that's something that is more of it almost feels like an administrative or a tactical issue at the retailer. And it does feel solvable, but it's going to have to come with education and help and partnership. And I think not every single retailer is doing this, but there are some out there, and we got to figure out how to solve that problem.
Yeah, you're spot on. And it's like creativity and partnership is the way through this one. And that will deliver some case studies that then we can go leverage to get more of the work done that needs to be done. But ultimately, we're not asking retailers to not make money on these items. We're not asking them to even fundamentally move away from good, better, best, or the existing pricing architecture that is proven, makes them money, and they need to do for their business. Full stop. Like, we got it. We're with you there. But, if you really are committed to farmer livelihoods, biodiversity, climate change, regenerative, like you say you are, let's get some seats at the table for all of us to sit down and figure out, can we take less of a margin on promos? Can we create EDLP programs? Like, there's this whole relationship on the shelf between pricing and velocity. And all we're saying is, if we just do the status quo, it's not gonna work. And so how do we just investigate creating some non-status quo solutions that can solve for yes, delivering the margin that the brand and the retailer and the distributor needs, but increase velocities on these items so these brands can grow, these supply chains can grow, and more farmers can adopt these practices.
Totally agree.
Go ahead, bro.
Yeah, so let's jump into number 5. We're almost there. There's 6 total challenges. Number 5. Regenerative brands are often supply chain constrained. You, I think, have got more experience in the ag world than I do for sure. So talk about why these supply constrained farming practices, like why is this hard?
Yeah. I mean, you've given a good example of this multiple times, which is kettle and fire. It's like if you guys could be regenerative for every single SKU, you would. But it's not possible today because of availability and or pricing. And that and or pricing, I think, is a really important thing that often gets left out of this conversation because there are some commodities, some ingredients where there is enough regenerative supply, but you can never get it into the pricing structure that the brand has or that an incumbent brand could win in the marketplace with. So it's not just about availability, right? It's also about pricing, and it's also about farming timelines, right? Most of these things, especially in the crop world, they happen one time a year. You might have a weather event, you might have some loss that year, you might have a crop failure. So it's building new supply chains is hard. Availability is interesting and somewhat of a gamble. Overall availability of the supply can be constraining, and then pricing of the supply can be a non-starter for a lot of the brands trying to launch regenerative products and or have regenerative ingredients in products.
Totally agree. And I think let's bring it down to or use the example of some of the brands who are tied to very specific farms, right? Like land, literally access to land can be a constraint to grow and scale your brand because if you don't have enough acreage to grow enough products to land a national deal at Walmart, like you can't grow. And the time it takes to get the regenerative certification or verification on product, it takes time. So to get the rest of the supply chain and the farmers to start to implement these practices, it all takes time, effort, energy, money. So regenerative brands almost by default have to grow slower, which we haven't really discussed this yet. Actually, this is jumping into the financing piece here pretty quickly. So this is a good segue, but that it's a different model. It's not like I like to talk about liquid death. Like liquid death innovation, they're putting water in a can. They can grow very, very quickly. And I think they're doing great things. Not trying to diminish what they're doing at all. But for a brand like Roots Potato Chips, they can't just put more regeneratively grown potatoes in a bag because regeneratively grown potatoes don't really exist in many places, which leads to a number of different challenges. Many of that leads to like some financing and why that's difficult. So AC, bring us home with that challenge because I think that you are well positioned to articulate these problems.
Yeah. Before I do, I just want to say one thing about the supply that like we are hopeful about, which is there's a proliferation of people that care about creating more regen supply, and so just the general availability has drastically increased, and the awareness of brands like trying to find it has drastically increased. And I like what I'm seeing a lot of the certifiers put time and effort and key hires into, which is they're trying to build supply chain companies on top of just certification businesses, which we need them to do because ultimately that's how the purchasing decision at the brand is going to be made. I'm looking for rock this, I'm looking for Regenified this, I'm looking for land to market this. And it has some specific spec where they can go help these brands put together some supply availability and build some supply chains. So we're looking forward to following that work and supporting it whatever way we can. But I think there's some good momentum there. All right. Last and final challenge, as Kyle alluded to, financing for regenerative brands is insufficient and misaligned. This one is a major issue. It could very easily be number one, or it's probably equally as important in the cycle, right? Number one and was all about the consumer and how we actually sell the products. And the last one here is like all about how we fund the businesses. And those are pretty interchangeable chicken and egg conversations. Can't sell the product, the business shouldn't exist or can't exist. If you can't fund the business can't exist. Most of the work we do is really focused on the emerging brands. So that's who we're really talking about here. Like established brands that have regenerative supply chains or regenerative products, like their ability to receive financing and investment is definitely very different. So we're really talking about your sub $25 million, even sub $10 million type brands that they're building these incumbent emerging brands and product portfolios that can scale regenerative supply chains and provide a regenerative option in a category that maybe doesn't have one or needs one. And the big issue is in the regenerative space, you have most of the money and the attention and the capital allocation going to the actual farming processes. So that's buying farmland, or that's investing in sustainable ag tech, or that's providing loans to farmers, which is all super important. And if we don't transition to farmland practices, we're not going to accomplish anything. And we also have to farm these enterprises that are interfacing with the consumer and providing end markets for the shit that's being grown. Because if it has no end market, why is someone going to grow it? And how is someone going to make money on the growing of it? So that's the general gist of, I think, the ReGen side and the main problem on the ReGen side. On the CPG side, like you said, growing these businesses is unique. And it's not that the existing financial instruments in terms of equity investment and debt investment don't work at all. They definitely do. And there's many brands that have been well capitalized by what I would call traditional structures and instruments, but they are not a fit for the vast majority of these businesses. And we don't have other options for them, or we definitely don't have other options that are well enough known to attorneys, accountants, and investors for us to go stand up the deals quick enough and get the money in there quick enough and not have a level of complexity that kind of makes them dead in the water. So we end up with a scenario where regenerative brands are significantly underfunded or kind of misfunded, and we need to fix that because it's a key issue.
That was a lot to digest.
You probably have brain fog because I'm just saying so much crazy shit.
I can't blame you, but it might be a contributing factor. But I think you're right. In my time working in the natural products industry, like the VC funded 5 to 7 year turn and burn, give us some money, scale your brand, get national, sell. It just simply, that model doesn't work for regenerative brands. Like we already talked about, it's much more difficult to have your supply chain available for to scale from a regional brand to a national brand in 3 to 5 years. That's almost impossible with a lot of these different regenerative supply chains. Number one. Number two, I think that a lot of these founders have a different goal than some of that, 2010, 2015 CPG space, where it's like, hey, I want to get acquired and make some money. It's more about, I want to run a business that's going to last a long time. So an eventual acquisition might not be the long-term goal for a lot of these brands. You talk to a lot more of these founders than I do. Like, what's your answer to that question? How do you think these founders are different than the previous era of, call it VC heyday natural products founders?
Well, it's just you have a different scorecard, right? It's like the triple bottom line or the B Corp kind of thing, or whatever. It's just you are a business, so you're ultimately worried about growth and the P&L and profit. Yes, they are all worried about that, but in addition to that, they have other criteria that a lot of these other businesses don't have. And that's a choice. No one's making them do this. This is a capitalistic society where that is a choice. But if we're assigning societal benefit to that, shouldn't there be some sort of reward for that, is really what we're saying. And so, a few of the things that once we get this head of capital hired onto the team and they really start running with this, that I'm interested about us researching and exploring is on the debt side. The two main things that at least an emerging brand are usually looking for is a general line of credit or inventory financing. And is there a way for us to offer reduced interest rates or a variable interest rate based on tying the inventory financing purchase specifically to regenerative farm, right? It has sequestered this much carbon. It has helped with this much water infiltration. It's, alleviated this much poverty. That should be financed at 3% versus 10% because there's all this societal benefit that we haven't realized anywhere in the accounting of just the business overall. That's one example of something that I think we're going to investigate and try and work on, that I think is a path of potential success. And on the equity side, I love what Elliot Began at TIG Brands is really championing with some of the new instruments he's really innovated or championed. But the problem with typical equity investments are it places too quick and too high of a growth demand on the brand that takes the money. It mandates a liquidity event, so an exit of some sort to return the investor any capital. And and it leads to binary outcomes, right? Really fast, high growth that is successful with an exit, or not, and basically the lights and the money get turned off and it's a failure. We have to find some middle path. That tool is still a good tool for some brands, but it's not the right tool for many brands. And so as I think about what we want to learn and provide research and maybe eventually provide a solution on in the equity side, is how do we make investments with more alignment between the investor and the investee, shorter time horizons, clear objectives as to what the business is going to achieve in those shorter time horizons, more liquidity, and not having to have that big liquidity event at the end that's many years down the road to basically be boom or bust, binary success or failure. So easy to throw those thematics out. We definitely don't have, I think, the perfect tool or tools yet to go bring a solution forward there. But it's like that whole quote about when you're chopping down the tree, spend 90% of the time sharpening the axe and 10% of the time actually chopping down the tree. Like, we need to spend 90% of the time really deeply studying this iceberg of the problem, which is the way these brands have been financed historically, to create something to do it different in the future.
Super well said. I know I've heard you talk about this so many times, and I feel like each time I do, I still learn something new. So I really appreciate your perspective and ability to kind of articulate the problem so well, and the potential solutions, and to acknowledge like why this is hard, and what it's going to take to get us where we need to be. And to your point, like, if we can't figure out the financing part, like, it makes it that much harder, despite all the other challenges we've already discussed. It's that much harder to be a regenerative brand. And these are the people who are working extraordinarily hard to try to do the right thing for the societal benefit you alluded to earlier, getting no credit for that work. So yeah, we really got to figure out how to fix this.
Amen. I mean, and we could say that about all of them. I mean, it's like this, there's so much hope in regeneration. And we got to solve some of these really nitty gritty, hard problems of how we make the economics work and how we make these businesses work better. Because they're working on our behalf for our nutrition and the health of the planet and these other things. We need to make the economic system work a little bit better on their behalf to reward them for some of those efforts.
No doubt.
Super fun episode, man. Anything else to add? I got some CTAs on the report, but anything else on content or anything else?
I think we're good, man. I was gonna try to go down an accounting rabbit hole, but today's not the day. It's not the day for me. We gotta do that some other time.
Yeah, we will. But yeah, just a big thank you to everyone who listens to the podcast in general, follows us on, our newsletter, follows us on LinkedIn. Like, we couldn't get to this point of producing this report if people didn't care at all about this content. And clearly there's enough people that care that make us continue to produce it. And this was really like a seminal aggregation of a lot of efforts to date. So huge shout out again to Katie and Jelly Shot and Christina, and everyone that helped kind of put it together along the way. But we would super appreciate y'all checking out the report. We'll have a link to download it in the show notes. There's an automated survey that you'll get to provide feedback on that report. Please do tell us what you think. What did you love? What did you hate? What can we do better next time? What else do you want to learn about? And then also share it. I mean, share it on LinkedIn, share it with people directly. Like, we want as many retailers, brands, CPG service providers, investors, people in the industry, farmers, processors, like anyone who cares about creating more demand for regenerative through CPG. We want them to read this report and let us know if it's helpful, how it's helpful, and how we can continue to serve them in the effort to fulfill that goal. So just appreciate all the support, and everyone check out the report and let us know what you think.
Yeah, and if you don't look at the show notes, you can access the report at ReGen-Brands.com, and it's really simple to find. Go to resources, click on the report, enter some nominal information, social security number, address. But you got access to the report, so check it out.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate you, brother. Thanks, man.
Thank you.
For transcripts, show notes, and more information on this episode, check out our website, regen-brands.com. That is regen-brands.com. You can also check out our YouTube channel, ReGen Brands, for all of our episodes with both video and audio. The best way to support our work is to give us a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast platform and subscribe to future episodes on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. You can also subscribe to our newsletter, the ReGen Brands Weekly, and follow our ReGen Brands LinkedIn page to stay in the know on all the latest news, insights, and perspectives from the world of regenerative CPG. Thanks so much for tuning into the ReGen Brands podcast. We hope you learned something new in this episode and it empowers you to use your voice, your time, your talent, and your dollars to help us build a better and more regenerative food system. Love you guys.